Radio check, over.
We're just starting another UNET mission, this time to the Nuba Mountains. We're bringing spare tires, we're bringing spare jerry cans, we're bringing a lot of water.
طلبت حكومة السودان
20 years of civil war has intensified Sudan's environmental problems. Now that peace has come, the Sudan government has initiated a series of fact-finding missions to document these challenges.
Sudan is a country which has been embroiled in different conflicts, mainly between the north and the south, and this has led to problems with the management of environmental resources.
Okay, we've come from Tolodi, we're on the way to Kalogi, then we're heading up north to Abujabaya, the county capital on the easternmost edge of the Nuba Mountains.
We're in a minefield. We've been traveling in a minefield for the last 15 to 20 kilometers.
So that was my introduction to the Sudan. So a little bit, okay, so what David and I are going to do very quickly is describe a little bit about ourselves. We don't have that much time. First thing, I'm working for the UN, so I always have to say I'm an American. I have 2 master's degrees, one in marine geophysics and the other in environmental science and management, which I received from the Bren School here last year. I'm a professional documentarian. I specialize in environmental media, and I'm now going to tag it over to David, who is a Canadian.
Thanks a lot, Douglas. My role here is actually to take it up one level and to give you an overview of how the UN Environment Program understands the environmental impacts of conflicts and disasters. So I'm going to take it up a level and explain the implications on the environment of conflicts and disasters, and then we'll take it back down to use Sudan as an example. As was mentioned, I'm Canadian. I have a master's in biology and an undergrad in resource geography. Now I've specialized in post-conflict and post-disaster assessments. I so far have worked on 20 countries and spent 3 years primarily on Afghanistan. And the point that's not there, it's also not in the bio, is that while I do not have a Pulitzer Prize, I was Employee of the Month at McDonald's. So.
Very important.
Yeah, very important. So, how do you understand, or how do we understand the environmental dimensions of conflict? We have a conflict or disaster that strikes. Now, when we first started this program in 1999, looking specifically at these issues, we understood that conflicts and disasters typically cause environmental contamination through chemicals that threaten human life. If you have mercury, if you have other kinds of nasty chemicals, toxic chemicals contaminating the environment, that can cause death today, it can cause death tomorrow, it can cause death in 2 weeks' time. And our initial program was set up to mobilize experts to identify those kinds of risks and mitigate them. But as we evolved our understanding of the dimensions, we came to realize that there are other impacts. For example, the waste that may be created by a disaster or a conflict. In some cases, you have massive deforestation of resources, and those kinds of sort of secondary impacts affect livelihoods. They really affect jobs. You know, if you've got massive deforestation, people can't find timber to build houses. They can't find timber to cook and things like that. So there are other kinds of implications. And that's where we sort of ended there. We have this hierarchy of risks. And then we started realizing, in fact, that environmental degradation itself can actually drive conflict. And a good example here is Liberia. Mismanagement of resources coupled with poverty, coupled with corruption, actually feeds into the conflict cycle. So environment is both impacted by conflicts, but environment also can contribute to conflicts and disasters. Then we had another epiphany. And that is that if the environmental impacts of a conflict and disaster are not addressed, that can actually feed into this compounding crisis cycle. So you get this cyclic effect, and the country moves further and further away from development. So what the Environment Program of the UN tries to do, it tries to come in with 3 types of activities. The first is to actually identify where environment can actually increase the likelihood of a disaster or a conflict. Second, if a conflict or disaster does occur, we come in with this emergency response kind of application where we send in field teams immediately within 24 hours to identify where a risk might be. And then third, we come in with a larger set of teams to try to ensure that the recovery process is sustainable. And what we're trying to do is use the shock of a crisis to reorient these countries towards more sustainable forms of development. And this very much influences, this understanding influences how we communicate our message, and you'll see this in the Sudan film. So in summary, we provide a neutral voice. We can come in and be this neutral party to determine what the impacts on the environment were. As I mentioned, we conduct these scientific assessments using international experts and national experts, and then we communicate the science to the policy, and this is where the media comes in. Two examples for you. The first is Banda Aceh. You've probably seen this slide already. The top is the pre-tsunami photograph. The bottom is the post-tsunami photograph. And as you can see, Banda Aceh was wiped off the map. In the process, 10 million meters cubed of waste was generated. 60,000 wells were destroyed. Now, obviously, that waste, for example, becomes a source of risk if it's not disposed of properly. It can contaminate water and these kinds of things. But perhaps more importantly, for the environmental perspective, rebuilding Banda Aceh itself takes resources. And in this particular area, the resources were coming from protected forests down south in Indonesia. So these are the kinds of things that we're trying to make sure, that we try to identify and make sure that the reconstruction process is on a sustainable pathway. Lebanon, we were in Lebanon recently. As you probably recall, 15,000 tons of oil was released during the conflict, creating different types of health risks. The photograph on the right is actually the oil at the bottom of the ocean where our diver is taking samples. Other examples from Lebanon, at the moment you've got 1 million different cluster bombs that are currently in agricultural areas. Those areas are no longer able to produce food, and people are moving from the agricultural areas to marginal lands to grow, and there are implications of that. In addition, the photograph on the right is the waste generated during the Lebanon conflict, and what you cannot see is that that waste is being dumped directly into the ocean as a stopgap measure. Now, the implications on fish and health and these kinds of things are potentially significant. Now, we are using different tools to communicate these messages. I'm just going to start up Google Earth. We have a partnership with Google Earth, if I can. We have a partnership with Google Earth where all of the satellite images that we collect are freely available on Google Earth. And as I will show you, all of the photographs we take at the field level and all the samples and everything else are actually uploaded into the Google Earth system. So everybody can download freely the information we collect. One second. Sorry. The web link is... There we go. So this is a site in Lebanon that we did one of the samples at. Took some of the samples. So first of all, the satellite imagery that we collect, the before scene, this is a feedlot, and the after scene. The feedlot was completely destroyed. All the photographs that our field teams are collecting are available online for use by journalists. And then more, or not more importantly, but interestingly, we can overlay the satellite images actually on top of the site in Lebanon. So you see the image there, and you can click on between the before and after image. So what we're trying to do with Google Earth is actually partner on a systematic basis, so all our information can be uploaded into this system. I see Douglas is approaching me, probably trying to tell me to hurry the heck up. I'm sorry, I'm moving on quickly. Okay, I have 2 more slides, and then we'll get into Sudan. What I wanted to talk about really quickly was our audience. Who are we doing this for? And there are 4 levels. Obviously, if there are risks, if there are serious environmental risks, we need to reach out to the public and communicate those risks so they take measures to protect themselves. Second of all, we're trying to reach out to governments in the affected countries themselves to change their policies, as I mentioned, to become more sustainable as they recover and reconstruct. Third, we're reaching out to donors and UN organizations to ensure that the money they're spending in these countries is done in a sustainable way. And finally, the global audience. We're trying to raise awareness at the global level on these kinds of issues and also get some visibility for UNEP. Now, the types of tools we use to communicate. When we started this work in '99, we just had reports. We had the typical technical report. And yes, it was nice. It had lots of photographs. But it's not enough in today's day and age. People don't have time to read thick and heavy reports. So as I mentioned, we're using different kinds of media. Google Earth is one of them. The video news release, what this is, Douglas will go into more detail in. It's a 3 to 5 minute summary of our findings. Green TV is another mechanism, and then we have an Earth report, which is more of a half-an-hour documentary of our work. So Sudan. We began our work in Sudan in 2005. It was the largest and most diverse country on the African continent, and for us it was the biggest challenge in terms of size and logistics. There are some quick facts on Sudan, which I won't go into, but what we agreed at the outset was this will be our biggest challenge, both in terms of logistics, security, and communications, and this is where we brought Douglas on board to really help us communicate the findings. I'll pass it on to Douglas now.
Okay, what's happening is in May, the date's been changed. June 15th, the country report for Sudan comes out. It's going to be released to the world. So that's this big 800-page document. Took them 2 years to all of these different surveys around the country, and you'll see more of that in what we have as a video, in the video news release. But so we've got a report, and we have a piece of video, and let's show you some of this stuff too. We're running out of time, so we're going to show video. I have to find the video. Okay. Okay. Now, what you'll see, we'll put this up. Now, this will be moving more in line towards the UN official what we want to show the world, as opposed to the first thing you saw. So this is all draft, still in a work of art, so to speak. Lights down.
As one war rages on in Sudan, another has finally ended. In 2005, the peace agreement between the Sudanese central government in the north and rebels in the south put an end to more than 2 decades of devastating conflict, Africa's longest civil war. 4 million Sudanese were displaced from their homes by the fighting. But a massive return process is now underway. But with the hope and enthusiasm generated by peace come many challenges. According to a new report released by the United Nations Environment Programme, Sudan is now faced with environmental risks so critical that they threaten its people's livelihoods and could jeopardize its long-term peace and stability.
This post-conflict assessment study by UNEP, I think, provides a dramatic illustration of how both the past and the future of peace and people's livelihoods in Sudan are inextricably linked to the environmental challenge.
The report is based on the most comprehensive environmental survey of its kind in Sudan. UNEP staff, together with national experts, undertook 12 assessment missions, travelling more than 12,000 kilometres across the country and interviewing more than 2,000 people. The resulting report warns of 6 major environmental issues facing Sudan today.
I think it is now critical that both at the top level of government in Sudan, but also at the level of local leadership, environmental awareness and the opportunities that sustainable natural resource management provides are taken as a key priority.
Okay, so what we've done is we've broken the video news release into 5 different sections, and because there were six sections, because there were 6 major findings. So we're gonna blow through this. So let's.
Land and water scarcity. Conflict over land and water rights in an increasingly deteriorating environment is a chronic problem throughout Sudan. In the south, the return of millions of people displaced by war is creating intense competition for land. Dinka tribes, for example, are leaving border refugee camps and returning to traditional lands that have been battlefields for the past 20 years. They bring with them large herds of cattle whose grazing needs far exceed the available rangeland, and put them in direct conflict with local farmers. This satellite image shows that overgrazing along the Nile now depletes fragile soils, leading to erosion, vulnerability to drought, and desertification.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show the end of the draft video news release so that we can now, because we're running out of time. So here's the ending, and then we'll talk about it, and depending upon how much time we have left.
Environment and conflict in Darfur. The links between the impacts of desertification, land degradation, and conflict are clearest in Darfur. In combination with other forms of land degradation, increasing drought has compounded the stress on farmers' and herders' traditional livelihoods and created a negative spiral of poverty, displacement, and finally conflict, as the intense competition for scarce resources has degenerated into violence. The tragedy in Darfur holds crucial lessons for the future of Sudan and the region at large. Just as environmental issues are among the major causes of ongoing conflict in Darfur, integrating the environment as a core element of the country's recovery process will be critical to its long-term success. Environmental awareness and action are now at a crossroads, and UNEP sees cause for optimism. A Ministry of Environment has been established by the new government of Southern Sudan. Wildlife reserves and protected areas are being created to address the loss of biodiversity. In June 2006, the Sud wetlands were listed as a protected site under the Ramsar Convention, an important step towards the conservation of Sudan's natural resources. But UNEP's report concludes that there is more to be done. With revenue from oil exports expected to exceed $12 billion a year, Sudan can for the first time afford to invest its own resources into environmental management and translate reform into concrete action.
We have a roadmap, we have investment opportunities, and we have the returns on that investment clearly identified. And it is now for both the United Nations family, but also the bilateral and multilateral donor community to look at how environment can be an integral part of the rehabilitation program and therefore also the peace process.
By taking such action, Sudan could become a model for integrating environment as a core aspect of peace building and post-conflict reconstruction. It could even take a leadership role in showing the rest of the continent how to effectively integrate environment in the development process.
Thanks very much. So the idea here really is to provide this video news release, these 6 segments, to journalists, both in country and internationally, for them to choose, to cherry pick the segments that they want to display on their, obviously, in their programs. It's not meant to be shown in one coherent and complete piece like that. It's for cherry picking, just to clarify that point.
My name's Jen Bernstein. I got my master's in geography here at UCSB in 2005. And I looked at the way that nature is depicted in print advertising. So in case you were wondering what Southern Comfort was doing to stop global warming, they are providing recipes for various alcoholic coolers. You can't read it from where you are, but actually below the recipe on the top it says, "Share with your new neighbors, the Eskimos." So I thought I would start by sort of posing the rhetorical question. Yeah, okay, it's also an excuse to show you guys my ad collection. This is another one of my old favorites, this Toyota 4Runner ad, the answering machine for the call of the wild. But why look at nature ads when the environment is in such a state of crisis and public awareness as compared to other issues is relatively low? Well, nature ads employ stories or narratives about nature that are floating around in our culture. And marketers have gone to the trouble of doing countless studies and focus groups to find out which ones of these narratives people most strongly respond to. So if we look at enough advertisements, we can come up with the 5 or 6 different ways that people sort of consciously or subconsciously view the natural environment. And people are going to assimilate facts in the context of these pre-existing stories. So if we as environmental communicators can weave our stories into a story that's consistent with someone's environmental narrative, they're going to be a lot more likely to be receptive to it. So what I'd like to do in this brief presentation is look at some prominent ways that nature is depicted in advertising, look at sort of some of the visual and verbal cues that are used to construct these ads, and look at some of the presuppositions and the consequences that are entailed. I'd also like to give a shot at giving some lessons and applications for the lessons learned from nature advertising in environmental media. So as Ron mentioned, this is based on my master's thesis research, which has been fun to revisit. And for this, I collected about 350 print advertisements from mainstream periodicals from the year 2001. Not all of the advertisements in this presentation are from that period, but a bulk of them are. So what I did was I coded different variables, different elements that I thought might be relevant. So for instance, I looked at the products that these ads were documenting. I looked at, so for instance, I was categorizing them as either advertising a vehicle or travel or clothing. I wanted to know if nature was used to advertise certain products more than others. I looked at what ecosystem was featured in the ad. So tropical ecosystems, forests, deserts, things like that. I wanted to know if certain products were going to be more likely to be advertised with certain ecosystems. I looked at whether or not the ads were environmentally friendly or not. And I looked at the need that the ad was capitalized on. There are a lot of sort of indexes of common needs that advertisements cater to, and so I tried to apply those to nature ads to see if nature is woven into stories where it could meet certain needs. And right now I'm learning a lot about cognitive linguistics, and I'm sort of trying to take a step back and look at these clusters of tendencies and try to cohere them into stories. So before I start launching into these different characterizations of nature, I want to mention that they're not exclusive of one another, and when I did the coding, I actually would often categorize a primary and a secondary narrative. So these are not exclusive of one another, nor are they the only narratives that could exist. But what I found on the whole was that the overarching characterization of the natural environment was of it as another. So it was as much defined as what it was as what it was not. And what it was not was the urban day-to-day environment. I would say about 60% of advertisements focused on nature being very other than one's daily life. So for instance, this advertisement for the Jeep Renegade, you can see that a full half of the space on this advertisement is full of this sort of joke, and the presupposition is that you're wearing a tie, and the instruction instructs you how to untie your tie and then go drive in the wilderness in your Jeep. But the fact of untying the tie has as much visual importance as the Jeep and the driving in the wilderness. Or you can just come right out and say it. I'm sorry, I don't know the product this is for, but this is from a Cabela's catalog from a few years back, and it's for bow hunting supplies. And it challenges you to leave the unnatural world, which apparently is where we are, and go into the natural world that is so natural, and buying their supplies will make us so natural that we'll actually look like the natural world when we're out there. So very much characterizing nature as the other. So one of these sort of sub-narratives of the nature as other is nature as a place to escape to. So presuppositions involved in these sorts of ads are that nature is unproblematic. Nature primarily serves as sort of a non-threatening backdrop for human activities, and nature is primarily there for relaxation. So you can see in this iTunes ad, it's sort of endearingly dated. The instructions at the bottom tell you how to load iTunes and burn a CD. So, but you can see the guys are hanging out, they're having fun together, they're mostly just relaxing in this nice cool car driving through the desert. Nature's sort of passively in the background and facilitating this other experience they're having. The Expedia ad, people responded very, very strongly, positively to this ad when I looked at people's responses to these. And it's pretty much the quintessential travel ad. Absent from this ad, of course, is permanent human habitation. stores where you might buy things, roads. It's really been constructed as this sort of fantasy in which you can go, you can have your week's vacation, and then come back. So another thing I did is I tried to statistically look at these sorts of ads. So what I did here is I pulled out the escape ads from my larger sample. There were 112 of these escape ads. And then what I did was a chi-square analysis. Basically what it means is how much of each of these categories were present in the sample beyond what would just be expected by chance. So if you look on the left side of the graph where it says product type at the bottom, you can see that the products of a vehicle or a vacation and travel are represented, are overemphasized in this sample of escape ads. It makes sense, right? Because if you're going to escape, you need a place to go and a way to get there. Underemphasized are home care and gardening, which also is sort of consistent with the narrative. If you're going to escape, you're not going to go and go gardening in your backyard and then, you know, scrub your toilet. So these ads, the escape ads, were predominantly not green ads, again, further creating this sort of fantasy of a place that doesn't have any, that doesn't require you to have any environmental responsibility. And the most prominent ecosystems were oceans and snow, with domesticated landscapes and forests, for some reason, being underrepresented. Obviously, oceans, especially tropical environments, and the snow are very romantic vacation destination type landscapes, but they're also places that most people don't really live permanently. So it's not just figuratively another, but it's literally another. It's an other place that we don't experience in our daily life. So what are some of the implications of this? Well, one is that nature is nice, but it's not really that necessary. If you don't take your yearly week-long trip to Yosemite, it's not the end of the world. In fact, you could just go to New York instead. And so it implies that nature sort of takes a second seat to the sort of larger world of work and our day-to-day lives. It avoids the environmental problems and the complications of these places that are featured. And since nature is out there and somewhere you only interact with when you're escaping your daily life, it minimizes the importance of actions that you might take in your daily life that would be of benefit to the environment. The next most predominant nature ad I saw, this was about 19.4, approximately 19.4% of the sample, was nature is a means of affirming oneself. So in these sorts of ads, nature is challenging. Nature is actively involved in your physical and your emotional state, so it's almost personified, kind of like a coach. And nature is primarily there for recreation. You're not going to go out and sort of challenge yourself and become a better person by building a dam. You're going to go there after work and challenge yourself by riding your mountain bike. This advertisement is for a BMW motorcycle, and you can probably see the text that says "See More Exotic Roadkill." But some of these, this is kind of a checklist of things you should do in your life, and it includes startle backpackers, instead of turning back, keep going, show up unannounced, turn a dead end into an entrance ramp. So all these sort of things that once you're faced with this landscape, you can sort of challenge yourself to do to become bigger and better than you were before. This is often done through the nature as a game metaphor. This Nature Valley Trail Mix Granola Bar series, which I don't think they're running anymore. At the top it says Mother Nature's Steam Room. There were a few other ads in this series. Mother Nature's Treadmill, I think, was going hiking. Mother Nature's Stairmaster was a skiing ad. So it takes a referent of a gym and then applies that to natural environment, so you know exactly what's what. This Outward Bound ad next to it, it says, maybe the next level isn't, and there's a small picture of a video game controller. So again, the natural environment allows you to go to a level that not even video games can go to. So the breakdown of these self-affirmation ads, again, vehicles are very heavily advertised. Overall, I found that vehicles were the product most frequently advertised in the nature ads. Vacations were actually less prominent than you might expect, which I think is consistent with my argument that when you're on a vacation, you're really going to escape and sort of languish around a pool. You're not really going to challenge yourself and become a better person. This is something somewhat different. And again, home care, underrepresented. You can see that, again, green ads underrepresented, and the two more dominant ecosystems are deserts and oceans. So deserts being sort of the iconic adversarial landscape, very stark, very severe. And apparently a grassland cannot challenge you to become better than who you are. Some of the implications of the nature as self-affirmation ads. Well, first of all, I think that there's some potential in these, or at least in the message. They can really be a source of positive associations. You know, studies have been done that showed if you enjoyed your experience and environment, you're going to be more likely to support environmental issues. So if people are actualizing this presupposition that they're taking whatever they've purchased and gone out and are going out into the natural environment and using it, that could be a good base to start with. Again, nature is separate, draws attention away from one's daily actions. And because there's no intrinsic value in nature itself, it puts it at risk. The value in nature in this characterization is what it does for you. So if you find a way that you can challenge yourself and become a better person through basketball or therapy or whatever you find, nature itself sort of becomes abandoned. The third most dominant narrative I saw was about 12% of the sample, and it's a sort of nature as victim environmentalism narrative. One of the presuppositions here is that nature is delicate, a victim of human progress and in need of protection. This Earth Justice ad, which says we're helping clients protect their mother, reads, over 98% of Utah's public lands are open to monster trucks, all-terrain vehicles, and dirt bikes, which leave lasting scars on fragile desert landscapes. Without reading too much into the gender issues going on here, there's very much this idea that nature needs somebody to come out and protect it from the ravages of humans. Another presupposition is that the human-nature relationship is indicative of greed, selfishness, and immorality. This Hitachi ad, which granted looks pretty mid-80s, says, to our grandchildren, will these waters be the pure essence of life or a dark sea of our shame and indifference? So it's very much a moral judgment being put on your choice as to whether or not to behave in a way that's responsible to the environment. And nature's victim environmentalism, another presupposition, is that the decision whether or not to degrade nature is unambiguous. In this Patagonia You Decide, Vote the Environment ad, you have one of two choices. You have a clear cut or you have a healthy forest. There's very little middle ground. There's no sustainably managed forest. It's very much one or the other. So sort of something interesting that I think has come around in the last 5 years, because I know I've been seeing these ads lately and I didn't see them very much from the 2001 sample, but this sort of modern environmentalism idea that alters this old presupposition, which is the old presupposition is that human interaction will inevitably degrade nature. And now there's all these other ads coming out into the scene that say that human interaction doesn't necessarily degrade nature. So you can see in the Shell ad, it's a farmer standing by his truck and reads, thanks to his stubbornness, the waste on this truck can be used to fuel it. And then the Ford Escape hybrid ad, they're the ones now that are doing the It Is Easy Being Green Kermit the Frog ads. But it reads, finally, there's a vehicle that can take you to the very places you're helping to preserve. Obviously, there's some problems when this is proposed within the context of a market system, but regardless, you see a lot more of these have your cake and eat it too ads right now. So the categorical breakdown, again, a lot of vehicle ads, not very many tobacco alcohol ads in these environmentalism ads, although I've met some environmentalists that might make me think otherwise, and very few gardening ads, which surprises me. I think that this represents a real opportunity to try to incorporate gardening, which actually involves an interaction with the natural environment, into the sort of larger environmentalist rhetoric. Again, an underrepresentation of green ads, so to me that looks indicative of some greenwashing. And one thing that still perplexes me, the ecosystem most usually used to advertise these environmentally friendly products, or not environmentally friendly, ones that appeal to environmentalism, because they definitely weren't the same thing, was no ecosystem at all, or one that I couldn't identify. The only thing I can figure out is that these sorts of ads are not capitalizing on the symbolic value of the environment, but rather the actual commodity chains that ensue from it. So what are some of the consequences of this depiction of the environment? Well, one, it completely reduces the complexity of our environmental situation. The obvious end goal, or the end result of this, is that you would go and you would buy the product and the story would end and you would achieve this larger goal of treating the environment better. It also reduces one's relationship to the environment to being either good or bad. You're either not harming the environment or you're harming the environment, and that's about it. And I really think this denies all the other ways in which we have to relate to the environment. And of course, it's been said before, but I'll say it again, which is that green consumerism is still consumerism, and the greenest product you could possibly buy is the one that you don't buy in the first place. So there's been a lot of people that have argued, and I agree with them, that advertising is a pretty limited forum on which to deal with environmental issues in a serious way. A couple other ads. I didn't go do the breakdown, but I'd like to mention nature's adversary. So the presupposition here is that nature is either ambivalent or aggressive towards humans. I didn't see these much in advertisements, but I did read a lot of newspaper reports after Katrina, and you can really see nature embodied this way in mainstream news sources. Nature requires either human fortitude or technology to protect oneself. So this is an ad for Motorola walkie-talkies, and it says you could use a cheap imitation if you know all the facts, like which bark you can eat until they find you. So this might seem somewhat like the sort of nature as self-affirmation, but this is not, you're not going to eat bark as a means of becoming stronger. Nature's actually there threatening to make you stay out there all night and eat bark. So this is sort of an actual, hearkening back to an actual fear of nature and purchasing products to be safer in it. And nature is wonder. I'm not entirely sure that this is the correct term for it, but the presuppositions in these sorts of ads are that nature is a repository of information that may or not be useful to human beings. Nature operates outside of human ecosystems, though through discipline and being really quiet and waking up early and sitting in the forest for long enough, we can get lucky enough to observe it. And that nature inspires awe and wonder. And I think that a lot of the work that we're going to be seeing here today is along this vein. This narrative entails many of the same behaviors as the environmentalism narrative in terms of being respectful and not intruding on natural processes, but it's absent of these moral undertones. And so while it may be apolitical in a lot of contexts, I think it has the potential to be a platform for political action at some point. So conclusions? Well, first of all, kind of the no-brainer is that there are environmental implications. As advertisers use nature to advertise products, real nature is degraded if people actually buy the advertisements, if they work. So the environment in its raw form is transformed, and then the environment before it was transformed is dumped onto that product and put in the marketplace to differentiate it. And it's used as a source of meaning. So it's used as a source of raw materials and then again as a source of meaning. And if there's anything that makes me think a society needs to rethink its relationship to the natural environment, it's something as bizarre as this. Second, I think that the dominance of the nature as other narrative should really inspire environmentalists to broaden their vision. If 60% of these advertisements are capitalizing on the need for someone to get away from something, and if that's taking the place in their brain of holding this sort of larger environmentalist vision, maybe we should think about what they're trying to get away from and look at people's work lives and look at these other things that are occupying the space in which they view nature right now. And of course, if a person really does want to get away from wherever they are and is going to go buy a product to do it, perhaps through addressing these other needs, we could preempt the purchase of more consumer goods. And third, in terms of the social change implications, we need to remember that environmentalism is a narrative. It's not the narrative. And to be able to make environmental media effective at changing people's behaviors, we need to understand what ideas about nature people already have in their heads before we show them something new, and really try to take that seriously. Because unless we present facts within the context of what they already believe nature to be and what it is to them in their own life, they're not going to be receptive towards it. So if we can become more understanding about that in whatever way possible, I think that will create more success for getting the message across in environmental media in the future. Thanks for listening. That's it.
So I'm talking about convenient truths. This is obviously a takeoff on Vice President Gore's notion of the environment. The images that I show you here are images that map science, and these are different disciplines in science here and how they connect to each other. The notion here, though, is that we want to get to environmental truth, or at least information, in a convenient way. And digital media certainly is one of the ways that we can do that these days. This comes out of Inconvenient Truths. Now, I know, again, that Al Gore has his sense of it, but Inconvenient Truths for me were things like slide rules, which you see in the upper left, and Leroy lettering systems. Do any of you remember that? I actually did my early work on these graphs that you see here, using those press-on letters and press-on tape and so forth, and you can see the line. You can see these little bars are crooked, and these are tacked on, and that was just very difficult to do, very onerous. And now, of course, we have all these digital means to do this. So one of the things I want to talk about today is how much easier it is to do analysis and get environmental information, and then how much more effective the communications can be using digital media. One of the ways, of course, we do that is through teaching and lecturing and formal education. I teach an introductory course on animals, and we use PowerPoint for that. And it's sort of odd because I'm not writing on the blackboard and the students aren't taking notes because they download my presentations like neither of us are doing our job. But one of the things we can do now, of course, are use PowerPoint, but we can also embed video,
so the coral is a very
like we see
simple
here.
animal. It's just a layer
This is a colleague of mine describing how corals form.
A cup. So you can imagine this being the tissue cup, and this is the little bag and the stomach inside with the mouth up here. The mouth has tentacles around it like this plumeria flower, and that's a coral polyp. Now the coral polyp secretes a shell around it like this coffee cup, and that would be what we call a solitary coral, one polyp and one shell around it.
So that's a way to explain. The students always ask me, well, how do you get from that little soft thing to that, hard thing that's coral? And Steve, in his little 2- and 3-minute clips, is able to describe that. There are problems, of course, with PowerPoint. There are some people who rail against it. You may have seen this. This is the Gettysburg Address done as though it were in PowerPoint, and it loses all of its charm. You'll see the date down here, November 19th, 1863. And you see at the bottom there, it talks about government of, for, by the people. And, instead of 87 years ago, it's 87 years and so forth. So there are some downsides to using PowerPoint. One of the main means of communication in our culture remains the narrative, that is written material. And this has been changed profoundly by digital access and internet access to scientific and other information. Here are a couple of examples of this. If you look at the upper left graph, this is the number of times the journal Ecology, the premier scientific journal in the field of ecology, was put back on the shelf at the Science Library at the University of North Carolina. And it went along at about 400 for probably 2 decades. And then in 2001, the library subscribed to something called JSTOR, which gave all of the past issues, except for the most recent 4 years, made them available digitally to faculty and students at University of North Carolina. And the number of issues reshelved dropped to 70. And then in 2003, they subscribed to a completely open access copies of Ecology, and for 2 years, not a single issue of the journal was taken off the shelf at the library. And they've now boxed it up and taken it off campus. So it went from 400 to 0 in terms of the use of paper information. The other graph shows electronic access to 2 journals, Ecology, again, the premier journal in the field. And what you see is the number of months after an issue comes out and how many downloads a journal gets. So here it gets 900 downloads the first month after it comes out, 200 after that, and then it stays at about 150 forever. The other journal is the Florida Entomologist, and this isn't to disparage Florida or insects, but it's just not as prominent a journal as Ecology. And you see that by the 5th month after an issue comes out, it has more downloads than Ecology, and that's because it's completely open access, free to everybody, anywhere, all the time from day one. So, and while ecology is still limited, even though it's electronically available, it's limited by subscription, either individual subscription or institutional subscription. So 5 months after an issue comes out, the Florida Entomologist is downloaded more often than ecology. And I'm now looking for ways to publish my work on gophers in an insect journal, just so that it will get more attention. One of the interesting manifestations, digital manifestations in narratives or in text are what are called spark lines. And these are promoted by a gentleman that everybody should know or know of, Edward Tufte, who is a profound minimalist when it comes to graphics. And he's developed these sort of font-sized graphics. So these are little graphics embedded in the text. And you can see them represented here in an Excel spreadsheet of some business information, and you see some blow-ups of them over here. And the idea is that as you're reading along and it says that Mr. Jones' blood pressure went up and then it went down, or the stock market went down and then it went back up, there's a little graphic right there, and you don't have to go looking at some other page or glance off from your reading. You just get a sense of what's going on by these graphics. And the interesting thing is that they can be uploaded dynamically, so that every 15 minutes you might get a new plot or a new point is added to the plot. And I think these are really exciting, and once again, Dr. Tufte is a leader in this field. This is something roughly similar, although it uses icons instead of graphics. So here's a little graphic about the inputs, agricultural inputs into a bay. And as you're reading along, there are these icons that tell you what's going on. So it says that they used perforated cups, and they used this instrument called a Secchi disc. And instead of looking at some legend over here and having to look away from the text, you can actually see that embedded in the text. The one problem I see with this is they've gone overboard. These are like international highway signs. But it's not like a fish. It's like a species of fish. So you're going to have your field guide there, you know, thumbing through to identify all these species of fish. But the notion is to much more conveniently, for the reader, convey information. Another important feature, a digital feature that is changing the way we look at the environment, is moving from graphical representations like this. This is global warming over a period of time, showing the mean and some variation around that. So this is sort of the average temperature of the world. And that tells you something. That sums it up about as well as it can be summed up. But it's not quite the same as the information you get at, say, looking at this graphic. So here are the continents, and these are scales of where temperature is going up or has gone up and is going down. And what you see is massive increase in temperatures, 1.5 to 2 degrees at the northern latitudes, of course, where it's going to have the greatest, or some of the greatest impact, because it's cold and there's ice up there and it's going to melt. A few places where it's going to get a little bit chillier. So if you could do this, you could present this information in this form, but you'd have to have one of these graphs for every place on the planet. And that would be difficult and crazy to do, and it also just doesn't convey the information the same. Now, obviously, it's different information. This could be detailed information about Santa Barbara, but this gives you global information. So being able to do global maps, and in this case, done from either computer modeling, or say you were actually measuring temperature from satellites, or vegetation from satellite, actually the digital information comes in a way that allows it to be put on a map, in this case, a global map. Here's some. I pulled these off of a really great site at the University of Arizona, and I do have permission to use these, by the way. So you can see that if you look at winter temperatures, it's going to increase by about, it's projected to increase by about 5 degrees by the end of the century. Summer temperature increase about 6 or 7 degrees, again, by the turn of the century. Look at the 8 degree Fahrenheit increase in the Intermountain West, and a 10% decrease in precipitation. So you put these things together, and we know the conditions that we're under now, where it's warm, we have warm, dry periods, and all the ancillary effects that that's going to have, including fires and so forth. So this kind of information is very valuable. And again, it can be done in a dynamic sense. It can be updated. It can be changed as the results from computer models and so forth. The parameters are altered. So these are extremely valuable ways of conveying information. Again, I remember actually taking, having maps, printing out maps and buying printed maps and then putting shaded information on them to make the graphics to convey this same type of information. This is a really interesting source of information. This is called Gapminder, and I think Google just purchased it. And what you see here is the percent urban population, these are countries, percent urban population, and carbon dioxide emissions. Of course, these are greenhouse gases. And there's a lot of information in here. The size indicates the total population, it's color-coded by region in the world, and it tells you a lot. This is a snapshot in 2001, and it tells you a lot where any one country happens to lie in this particular information space. I want to go to the cool part of this, which is that this can be done in a dynamic setting as well. So if we take a look, if we play this, you can see countries are sort of increasing in urban population. The dots are all kind of scooting up to the left, and carbon dioxide emissions are kind of increasing. The other thing that you can do here is focus on particular countries. So if we look at, say, China and the two Koreas and follow what happens to them, it's quite illustrative. So what you see here is that China is becoming more urbanized, and it's increasing its CO2 emissions somewhat. These are log scales, which means that little tiny changes are actually huge differences. But the more interesting thing is how this is North Korea and this is South Korea, and how South Korea has caught up with North Korea in urbanization, scooted way ahead in both urban population and CO2 emissions, which is not necessarily something they want on their resume, I suspect. But look what happens in North Korea during times of famine and reduced industrialization. So these are really effective graphics. You can get static impressions at any one time. You can animate them in a way and customize them in a way that gives lots of information. I think this, to me, is very exciting. The Gapminder folks have some wonderful graphics similar to this about human health around the world. I know we've already seen the Google Earth and some of what it can do. I want to show you another example. If we take something like, that's okay, I hope. If we take an example, we saw some very similar graphics like this in the talks earlier. So we're going to zoom in on Las Vegas. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit more so we get a little bit closer look at it. And then what we have here is the population, the urban sprawl of Las Vegas in May of 1973. And as we do this, slide this bar, we'll see a change to 2006. And you can just see the dramatic change there. Now there aren't actually photographs for the intervening times. It's just that it interpolates between the first photograph and the last photograph, and that's pretty striking. You can do this in sort of any place in the world. A very dramatic visualization. Now clearly there are numbers that go analyses that can be done and behind the scenes on this, and numbers that are behind the scene on this. But graphically, it makes a very strong case. My guess is that the general public, any interested layman would be interested in this, but this helps scientists as well to get a quick sense of how things are changing. This is a project that's going on right here in Santa Barbara called PISCO, Partnership for Interdisciplinary Studies in Coastal Oceans. Those of you who may be familiar with the Southern Hemisphere might know that pisco is also a tasty drink that's served primarily in Chile, and knowing some of the people in this, my guess is that's actually what prompted the name. But these are data, dynamically generated and graphed data, in this case information about the Channel Islands. And it can involve many species of fish, I think maybe now 60 or 80 species of fish. The yellow bars indicate areas that are outside of protected areas. Green bars are inside of protected areas. So you get a lot of information here. And then you can also click on a particular bar and you get additional information. For instance, this shows the abundance of this particular organism over time. You can also find out more information about the site. So here, the bottom, in this particular bar that we have pointed here, the bottom is 8% sand and 4% cobble, et cetera, but you can also click on that and you end up with an actual physical characterization of the bottom. You get a visualization of what that bottom looks like, both in terms of the substrate makeup and in this case the kelp that grows on it. And this is real-time, always available online with customized information for many kinds of organisms and many kinds of places. It's just spectacular. And this is one of the major research projects here at UCSB, and Steve Gaines, who will be talking later, is part of this. We can take this to even further by looking at simulations. This involves pollutants in the Stockholm Harbor. And we can see that they're coming out of these side tributaries. They get out into the open water and they're sort of diluted. If you watch down here, you'll see that there is a tidal surge, and so stuff is flowing out as the tide is going out, but then it gets flushed back in as the tide comes back in. So this gives you a same sort of visualization, but through time, a very important capability. And if we wrap all of this up into kind of everything, there's this, using all of these tools, there's something called the Decision Theater at Arizona State University, and this is sort of environmental sensorama. So it has everything that we've sort of included here. This has some sound if you want to turn it up. Is the sound on?
Talk about putting in centralizing solar.
If you look closely, they have 3D glasses on. It's kind of cool.
Centralized facility here. This is about 20 acres and produces about 5 megawatts of electricity.
So this is just another means to convey information, and in some cases when they're talking about cooling, about energy use or the heat in the desert, they actually turn the thermostat up in the room so that you feel like you're sweating as part of the process. I want to end with a couple of things. One is, if you haven't seen this book, the book's not spectacular, but certainly the notion is this idea of wikinomics, which is sort of wikis and economics. And the tagline is how mass collaboration changes everything. This graphic on the right here is a graph of the collaborations that take place within and between groups at the synthesis center that I direct. And the notion is that what's going to change in the way we operate in the world is instead of working in closed groups, those little groups of engineers that design a car or scientists that get together to collect some information or environmentalists who want to solve some environmental problem, we're going to make the information broadly available, and the world is going to collaborate out of the specific interests of individuals. And my guess, we have a project we need to do at the center where I work, and we want to make sure that one piece of software can talk to the other. And we're probably going to hire a programmer. It's going to cost us $100,000 a year. I suspect that we could put a $10,000 prize out there to whoever could do this, and it'd be solved in a week, and it'd only cost us $10,000. My guess is we could put out a coffee mug or a T-shirt, and it would be solved, because this is going to become a competitive market for solving, for developing solutions. And I think that's actually, this is going to change the world. The digital access to information and the fact that people can collaborate remotely.